Social welfare policies that have to do with providing housing for poor people or people who can't afford housing is supposed to fix a problem and offer a solution. I would say, though, that is a social problem because of the way it is done. First, there are lots of hoops you have to jump through to get housing. This can be hard for people who don't have the resources or ability to provide the needed materials for the application. In the article called Affordable Housing Shortage, published by CQ Press, they write that housing subsidies provided through HUD, Department of Housing and Urban Development, reach only about 25% of those who qualify. Some housing experts believe federal and state officials should provide more assistance to low and moderate income Americans. Another problem that I experienced personally in the type of housing that is provided and where it is located. When I was growing up, my dad was not around and my mom had to get assistance to afford a place to live. When we were always put in apartments in really dangerous parts of town. People, even kids, were getting killed on a regular basis. Not only are people put in dangerous parts of town, but a lot of minorities have to use social welfare for housing, and this actually ends up causing segregation or separation by race of people in cities. When you go to where I lived, for instance, you can see that nearly everyone there is black. I think that this is really a bad impact on society. Even though we don't have segregation anymore, people are still segregated in terms of where they live. This is true in cities where minorities are in housing and the city and white people live in the suburbs. This is bad for society as a whole because it separates people, but I think it also leads to high crime rates. People who are already not well off are put into small, often crowded buildings, and I think this leads to more crimes because you want to do whatever you can to get in a better situation than you are. I also think crime is impacted because people are living in such close quarters, and just to be honest, there are less resources available in the community. I do, though, not think this impacts everyone in the society equally. People who can afford their own housing and never need assistance don't have to worry about anything related to, except that they might be annoyed. Even when people were saying America was becoming more diverse and discrimination was no longer allowed, and maybe that is true in the workplace, but in terms of where people are living, it isn't. One thing mentioned in the Origin of Everything, published by the Public Broadcasting Service, is that even though over 2 million Americans are living in public housing, we never hear stories about what is going on there unless it is negative. Again, going back to my background, this is definitely true. All the stories on the news that talk about my neighborhood would be stories about when people were shot or arrested. You would never have heard a news story about anything good that might be going on there, even if it was just a small thing. In this video, they talk about that the history of public housing really started with the Great Depression because so many people could not afford or find housing that they could afford. Some people argue that there were other types of public housing before this, but this is when it really became a government-run thing to provide public housing. In the 20th century, public housing was created with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt as part of his 1933 New Deal that was made to address the Great Depression. Housing welfare has gone through a lot of changes since then. In the Housing Act 1937, the government actually built housing that could be used to rent to people who could not afford housing. In 1949, there was also the Housing Act that was passed. In general, it didn't do the things it promised and really wasn't that effective. The idea was to create better projects. These are called public housing projects. Each time there's a new administration, you hear more discussion about the Department of Housing and Urban Development that came in the 1960s. Over the years, there has been a lot of conflict surrounding the law. Although at first it was pretty successful, over the years there have also always been debates between politicians about HUD and how much funding should be provided to poor people. I know we talked about this in class, people that are required to look for work and meet certain standards to receive subsidies or funding. Also, the housing has not been regulated, and this has led to health and safety issues. Another thing you see mentioned a lot is that education provided to the kids living in these houses is not always the best and very often not as good as the education the richer folks who live outside of the city are receiving. This then leads to more years of inequality, and the children are not on the same level in the terms of education because of being in public housing. As you can imagine, this leads to disadvantages later in life, like perhaps not going to college or getting a good career. Overall, I think two things need to change. I think that people's perception of what they think of when they think of public housing and people who need it needs to be more open-minded. I also think that the Department of Housing and Urban Development needs to really look at how their policies are placing lower income people in inner cities almost across the board and how this can cause them disadvantages later in life. I think better public housing options that are a free-form area of crime and closer to better schools should be priority if we really ever want equality in America.